Hey everyone, welcome back to Steve's View. Alright, today I want to talk about what's happening in Minnesota, not just the protests, not just the shooting, and not just the political fighting that followed, but why events like this keep turning into national crises in the United States. Because if you've been watching this story unfold, one thing should be pretty obvious by now: people aren't even arguing about the same thing. Some people see this as a case of excessive force. Others see it as lawful self-defense. Some see a civil rights issue. Others see political theater. And then there's the federal versus state fight layered on top of all of it. What I want to do here is slow everything down and explain how a single incident ends up sitting at the intersection of immigration enforcement, election incentives, federal authority, media dynamics, and public trust in institutions. Not to tell you who's right, but to explain why the system keeps producing these outcomes. Let's start with the incident itself, because without grounding this in reality, everything else becomes noise. A man named Pretty was shot and killed by federal law enforcement officers during an enforcement operation in Minnesota. Almost immediately, the public debate split into two camps: those claiming this was an innocent civilian killed by excessive force, and those arguing it was a justified use of force during a dangerous encounter. Legally speaking, the case hinges on a very narrow but crucial question. At the moment lethal force was used, did the suspect still pose an immediate threat? In American law enforcement standards, that question matters more than almost anything else. If a suspect is armed or reasonably believed to be armed and is moving in a way that could allow access to that weapon, officers are generally authorized to use lethal force. If the weapon has already been secured and the threat neutralized, that same action can quickly cross into unlawful use of force. That's not ideology. That's doctrine. So when people argue endlessly online about intent or morality, they're often skipping the one factual question that actually determines legality: was the weapon still in play? At this point, there are competing claims. Some say the firearm had already been secured. Others say it had not. What's notable is that no clear, high-quality public evidence has yet resolved that question definitively, and in a media environment driven by speed and outrage, ambiguity doesn't slow the story down. It accelerates it. Now, here's where this stops being just a policing story. Because the officers involved were federal, not local, that immediately introduces a jurisdictional and political complication that wouldn't exist in an ordinary case. In the United States, states have broad authority over criminal investigations within their borders. But federal law enforcement also has independent authority when federal officers are involved. In theory, that means joint or parallel investigations are normal. In practice, it often turns into a power struggle. Minnesota state officials moved quickly to assert control over the investigation and to frame the incident publicly. Federal authorities, meanwhile, signaled that they would conduct their own review. This kind of standoff isn't rare, but when it happens in a politically charged context, especially one involving immigration enforcement, it becomes symbolic. It's no longer just about one case. It becomes about who gets to define legitimacy, and that brings us to the protests. Protests following police shootings are not new in the United States. What's different here is how fast the narrative expanded beyond the incident itself. Very quickly, demonstrations weren't just about Pretty. They were about federal immigration enforcement, more broadly, about whether federal agents should even be operating in the state in the way they are. This is where incentives matter. States governed by one political party often have fundamentally different priorities from the federal government when it comes to immigration. When federal enforcement ramps up, states that are more reliant on immigrant populations, economically, politically, or socially, feel the pressure first, and it's important to be precise here. This isn't about accusing anyone of bad faith. It's about acknowledging that policy choices create downstream effects. If immigration enforcement intensifies, undocumented populations shrink, relocate, or disengage. That affects labor markets, school systems, census counts, and yes, electoral dynamics. That doesn't require conspiracy. It's basic demography. So when federal enforcement actions trigger protests in certain states, it's not surprising. Those states experience the consequences more immediately, and their political leadership responds accordingly. Now add elections into the mix. The United States is heading into a highly competitive election cycle. Legal battles over voting procedures, voter rolls, and election administration are already making their way through the courts. Trust in the electoral process is fragile on all sides. In that environment, every major enforcement action becomes politically charged whether anyone wants it to or not. This is where things get uncomfortable, because it forces us to confront a structural reality. Once everything becomes political, even legitimate enforcement actions get interpreted through partisan lenses. If you already distrust federal power, you see abuse. If you already distrust state governments, you see obstruction. And if you distrust both, you see chaos. Media coverage doesn't help. Different outlets emphasize different aspects of the same event, reinforcing existing beliefs. Ambiguity becomes ammunition. Nuance disappears. At the same time, social media accelerates everything. Videos circulate without context. Claims spread faster than verification. By the time facts emerge, if they ever fully do, the narrative has already hardened. And here's the key point. None of this requires coordination or conspiracy to function. It emerges naturally from the system we've built. Federalism creates overlapping authority. Partisanship creates incentive to frame events advantageously. Media fragmentation rewards outrage. Election pressure raises the stakes. Put all of that together, and a single shooting can ignite a national political firestorm. Now, some people want to reduce this entire situation to moral absolutes. Either the officers were clearly wrong, or the protesters are clearly manipulating the situation. But reality rarely works that way. It's entirely possible for federal officers to act within their training and authority, while the broader enforcement strategy still produces instability and backlash. It's also possible for protests to begin as genuine expressions of concern and then become politicized as different actors respond. The danger comes when institutions stop trusting each other altogether, when states assume federal investigations are illegitimate by default, when federal agencies assume states are acting in bad faith, when the public assumes every outcome is rigged. That's when the system starts to grind instead of correct itself. What worries me more than this specific case is the pattern it fits into. We've reached a point where almost any use of force by the state, especially in contexts involving immigration or federal authority, becomes a proxy battle for much larger questions about power, legitimacy, and national identity. And those questions don't have easy answers. Should immigration enforcement be aggressive or restrained? Should states be able to resist federal priorities? How much force is acceptable in uncertain situations? Who gets to investigate whom? These are foundational questions, and we're now trying to answer them through street protests, court filings, and viral clips instead of deliberate institutional reform. That's not sustainable. Whatever the final findings are in the Pretty case, they won't resolve the underlying tensions. Even a clear legal ruling won't restore trust overnight. Because trust isn't built by verdicts alone. It's built by systems that people believe are fair even when they lose. And right now, too many Americans don't believe that. So when you watch what's happening in Minnesota, I'd encourage you to see it not just as one incident, or one protest, or one political fight, but as a snapshot of a country struggling to manage enforcement, accountability, and legitimacy at the same time. This isn't about heroes and villains. It's about incentives, structures, and consequences. And until those are addressed, stories like this won't stop happening, no matter who's in office. Thanks for watching.